Good morning and welcome to the Oregon Employment Department's listening session for Friday, November 3rd. My name is Dee Leahy and I am the Unemployment Insurance Division Director here at the Employment Department. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Alrighty, let's get started. So hello again, my name is Lindsay Leahy and I'm the Unemployment Insurance Division Director here at the Employment Department. Thank you so much for joining us today. This listening session is being simultaneously interpreted in Spanish. If you would like to view the simultaneous interpretation, please follow the instructions shown on the slide, which are click the interpretation box in the bottom Zoom bar and then choose Spanish. The presenter's voice will be lowered while the interpreter speaks over it. You can choose to mute the presenter if you prefer. Before we get to today's topic, we want to remind you that this is a public webinar that is being recorded and will be posted online. We cannot discuss any claim or business-related issues in this forum. Do not put personal or business information into the Q&A or chat boxes. For help with a claim issue, please use our online Contact Us form at unemployment.oregon.gov or call 877-345-3484. For business issues, please send us a message at francis.oregon.gov/employer or call 503-947-1488. During the next 60 minutes, you will hear some information and background on the topic of equity and good conscience. And we also want to gather your perspectives as we explore making changes to our administrative rules. Protecting the integrity of the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund continues to be a priority for the Oregon Employment Department. And we want to make sure that as we contemplate possible changes to our rules, we take into consideration all perspectives to ensure that the changes that we make are equitable. In 2021, the Oregon Legislature updated the law to expand the Employment Department's ability to waive overpayments if collection of those overpayments is against equity and good conscience and are not a result of fraud. This law change applied to overpayments in effect on or after June 23rd of 2021. Additionally, the law changed the meaning of a waiver of recovery so that a waiver is an extinguishment of liability of the debtor for the amounts that are waived. Prior to this legislation, if the Employment Department granted a waiver, debt collection was waived for 6 months, and then the collection activity would resume on the debt amount or in some cases, another 6-month waiver might be granted. We made changes to implement the expansion of waiver eligibility and system changes to eliminate the debt if an overpayment waiver is granted. Now we would like to explore the standard that we use to determine if collection of a debt is against equity and good conscience. The standard that we use today has been in place since prior to the passage of the 2021 legislation. When determining if collection of an overpayment is against equity and good conscience, one of the things we look at is to see if the individual claimant has no means to repay the overpayment and has total allowable household expenses that are equal to or exceed 90% of the total household income, less benefits from the unemployment insurance program. We use the Internal Revenue Service Collection Financial Standards to determine maximum household expenses when processing overpayment requests. While we believe this standard is equitable, we know that there are other standards that we could use, and we would like to gather input from interested parties to hear if the current standard should remain in place, or if there are other standards that we should consider using when determining if collection of an overpayment is against equity and good conscience. Now we're going to go over the details about the comment and question portion of today's listening session. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to unemployment.oregon.gov. Since this listening session is limited to 60 minutes, we ask that you keep your comments to 5 minutes or less. We may need to reduce the comment time to 2 minutes if a large number of people would like to comment. That way, we can be sure everyone has the opportunity to be heard today. If there is limited participation, we may end the webinar early if there are no more comments or questions. If you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, please raise your hand and I will call on you. Make sure to state your full name and tell us if you are making a comment or asking a question. If you are joining us today by phone, please press *6 to unmute yourself when you're called on. If technical difficulties prevent you from participating today, please email your comment or question to communications@employ.oregon.gov. If you do not want to speak, but have a comment that you would like to share or a question you would like answered, please put your comment or question in the Q&A box. Our unemployment insurance listening session panelists are available to answer your questions. They are Lisa, Tim, and Sarah. Please remember, we cannot answer a question specific to your benefit claim or business in this public forum. For help with a claim issue, please use our online Contact Us form at unemployment.oregon.gov or call 877-345-3484. For business issues, please send us a message at francis.oregon.gov/employer or call 503-947-1488. I look forward to hearing your comments and thank you again for participating today. Okay, it looks like Katie Thiessen has your hands up. Go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Lindsay, and great seeing everyone or not seeing you all. Sounds like there's folks behind the scenes too. Katie Tyson with the Oregon AFL-CIO. Thanks for putting together these listening sessions. I think we've been in conversation about this after a little pause before. So appreciate the opportunity to sort of provide some feedback. Obviously, when an overpayment comes is obviously of critical importance to workers, right? When they weren't expecting that overpayment and suddenly have something that they didn't, an expense that they didn't know about, right? So I think really appreciate the tension of that work and how important it is to get it right. So I wanted to, say, I think it sounds like there's been some improvements in the IRS Collection Financial Standards to really help move the dial, but just want to, and this will sound familiar to some of you, just, kind of voice that it is still a really complicated standard, right? And so when you are dealing with unemployment insurance, right, or I think the reason that I'm particularly concerned about this right now is that the same standard is used for paid family and medical leave. And so when a worker is dealing with a medical emergency, like I think we should just be really, really thoughtful around when and if they get an overpayment when they're struggling with that medical emergency, right? Particularly, to sort of fulfill what I know is the true aim of equity and good conscience, right? To not like unduly punish a worker when it was not the fault of their own in particular, not willful fraud, right? So looking at the IRS collection standards, I think, as you all know, they're just complicated, right? Like if you're a normal worker and you go on there and you're trying to figure out your total allowable household expenses, I think it's just really overwhelming, frankly. And I think the folks who are able to navigate it are usually able to do so with the help of, frankly, like legal counsel, union. So it's just, I think, frankly, like an undue barrier. And so, I think there are a couple good models that I would really encourage the department to look into, one of which is Washington's rule on this same issue. I think in particular, they use other factors to determine equity and good conscience, including Medicaid enrollment, SSI, SNAP, TANF, if they have dependents, right, sort of like the family size, if the overpayment was the result of agency error, which I think is particularly important as we've seen during the pandemic, and then just like sort of this cause undue economic, physical, or mental hardship. Sort of what I would also add in there, right, is like health status, right, if someone's dealing with cancer, or paid family and medical leave status, right, and sort of some of those factors that I think folks should look into. I know the department, the state already has a lot of that data. When folks apply for those programs, right, they go through sort of a similar eligibility criteria process. And so as much as we can make folks who've already been through those, like, not have to do it again, feels like great for the worker and hopefully, great for state resources too, right? The other thing that I will just flag, and then I'll end here, is that, looking at the federal unemployment insurance form, it's much broader. It asks 6 questions around how an overpayment would negatively affect a household, right? I think it's just much more accessible for the worker. Want to, be clear that I understand that has impacts on sort of then the follow-up work that the department would have to do, right? Like it's a little probably less cut and dry. And I think, getting closer towards that model would better help really judge equity and good conscience and in every individual situation when folks are, getting this bill again that they really weren't expecting. So I'll end there, but again, thanks for the opportunity. I'm happy to have ongoing conversations at whatever level, and appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Katie. And I apologize for messing up your last name. I know what it is, and I read it on the panel.
No worries. It tricks everyone. Don't worry about it.
But thank you so much for your comment. Okay, and it looks like we have Bob Esterbrook. Bob, go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Bob Esterbrook for the Oregon School Employees Association. We are affiliated with AFL-CIO, but obviously also have a lot of interest in access to unemployment insurance and how that affects our members. I want to reinforce a lot of what Katie said. I won't repeat the things that she highlighted, but we are very interested in the same kind of direction that the AFL-CIO is advocating for. The piece that I really wanted to lift up and reinforce is particularly during the pandemic, but I think even when outside of those really kind of crisis circumstances, it can be really difficult for unemployment insurance claimants to access assistance, to get help understanding exactly how the process is supposed to go. And I know that the department tries really hard to make information available on the website. You have folks trying to answer questions, but we've seen a lot of cases where, depending on who a claimant talks to, they may get a different understanding of what they're supposed to do or not supposed to do. And so when revising this rule, I think it's really critical to make sure that rule language itself is clear enough that a sort of average claimant can understand what's going to happen. So for example, in the past, because the waiver wasn't fully a waiver, it was a waiver of collections. That was a place where people would misunderstand what was actually happening or what was going to happen. And I would note, we remain concerned that the way the rule is written currently in that regard may not fully achieve the intention of the legislation for extinguishment, but I appreciate, Lindsay, you were speaking to that. So it sounds like the department is aware of that issue. But to reinforce that difficulty accessing assistance, I think Katie is exactly right. Workers who have a union representative who can help them, or who have legal counsel, those kinds of things, that's good, but we really want to make sure that the rule is accessible and understandable for workers who don't have that kind of additional support. Particularly, again, I want to lift up the connection between this standard and paid family and medical leave, where we are going to have additional dimensions to what represents equity and good conscience, particularly because we're now getting into a range of additional situations rather than just someone has lost a job but may otherwise be quote unquote okay. I think the lens that OSEA would bring here additionally is that for a lot of our folks, the amount that they are eligible for in terms of unemployment benefits is fairly small because their wages are not great. And that means that when they are receiving unemployment, obviously, whatever they're able to get is very important, but then potential overpayments can be disproportionately impactful because they don't have any resources in reserve. They don't have the resources to fall back on, and so I think are particularly they are particularly likely to be in need of a waiver because they are not likely to be in a position where they could repay an overpayment. And frankly, we saw during the pandemic a lot of occasions where folks genuinely did not understand why they were or were not receiving benefits. And because it can be difficult to get clarity from the department, the waiver process sort of de facto becomes the way that they get more information or more understanding. And I'm confident that that is not the direction that the department wants to go. The waiver process should be more focused on particular circumstances, but we've definitely seen where that becomes sort of a safety valve or the one option that claimants may know that they can try to access for some kind of relief for their situation. And because of that, I think getting this rule understandable and clear for the average claimant, as I've said, is really critical. I just want to add, obviously, OSEA has had a lot of opportunity to work with the employment department staff in the past. We are always happy to participate in any kind of advisory opportunity that we can. So, including this listening session is very helpful. We appreciate the department taking the time to delve deeper into this issue. And we would look forward to additional conversation or providing more comment whenever that's appropriate.
Thank you so much, Bob. I appreciate you providing that feedback, and we'll add it to Katie's and others that we have received. And just to be clear, we do extinguish the debt. So it sounded like you might have thought there might be some confusion there, but we don't do the deferral process anymore. That is definitely, the debt is fully extinguished when the waiver is granted. So anyway, thank you so much. And looks like Beth, you have your phone. Apologize. Beth Englander, go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks, Lindsay. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry. Well, thank you for hosting this session, and also just thank you for paying so much attention to the against equity and good conscience standard, because it really is so important, and we really appreciate you like thinking deeply about it and listening about how people experience that standard. So first, a thank you, because we really appreciate that the agency has shifted and now uses the IRS standard, which is just like a fixed standard for determining whether people meet whether their expenses are, are greater than what the money they're taking in, so that they should qualify for a waiver based on against equity and good conscience. We would so appreciate that, and we would like to just let you know that folks, we still think it would make sense both from an agency's point of view and from the people who use OED services point of view, that there be some presumptive categories of people that just are going to qualify without having to do the kind of extensive application for a waiver. So like there are lots of categories that would make sense as presumptive against equity and good conscience, like people who are on TANF, or people who have significant language barriers and it's really hard to get, they had a hard time getting interpretation services, and a bunch of, and some other categories. And I also just wanted to suggest that that the application for state waiver is still pretty complicated, especially compared to, for example, the federal waiver of overpayment application form. And so I think one simplification that would help both the agency and people applying for waivers would be if someone's income is just like, if it is below that IRS standard, just presume that it is against equity and good conscience, and not not make people like submit their actual expenses to show that, to show their exact expenses, because that is a pretty onerous process. And it from our experience, it does turn people away. Like people, it's too complicated for them or too much for them to deal with given the other things that are going on in their lives. And so they so some people give up when they really should. They would qualify for that waiver. Also, the IRS standard it's a good standard, but it is not an easy one for people to understand. Like, oh, this is my income, so clearly I would meet this standard and my expenses, so clearly I'd meet this standard. So it would be really helpful if there was some chart or something that kind of laid out, if this is your income and this is your expenses, then this would be 90% of the IRS standard, so that people had some knowledge of whether it was worth it to be asking for a waiver or not. And yeah, and then I think I'll echo what some of the other speakers have said, which is the model, the Washington model right now. It is a really kind of very human-centered and fair model for overpayment waiver, and there are a lot of things from that process right now that it would be great for the Oregon Employment Department to adopt, in our opinion. I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beth. Appreciate it. I don't see any other hands raised, so just if you have a comment or a question, you're welcome to raise your hand, or you can put it in the Q&A box if you prefer. All right, I see. Bob, you have your hand up again?
I do, Lindsay, thank you. I was just going to ask a question. What Beth just said about presumptive categories reminded me to ask. Because now a waiver is a full waiver, it's a little bit of all or nothing. But I think there is some argument to be made that there are cases, there are different levels of case for equity and good conscience. And so I just wanted to ask whether the department would entertain having more than one, I'm going to call it a flavor of waiver, or different sort of levels of how the standard is applied, or if it is going to be simply there is one standard and either folks need it or they don't.
So through the listening sessions, I mean, we are, and thank you for the question, Bob. I mean, we're listening to everybody's ideas and kind of looking at what's going to work best and be equitable for, customers, both on the claimant side and the employer side, and trying to figure out, different standards. We do have, there's different types of debt that claimants have. So you have the fraud debt, you have non-claimant fault, so where they had nothing to do with the what caused the overpayment, and then you have the kind of middle category where folks did something but it wasn't intentionally fraudulent, they just made an error. And so when we look at, there are some different permutations in there, but what we're just trying to figure out what is the most equitable process that makes sense. So I think we were looking more at a sort of a blank standard that we have, either use the standard we have now or a different one that would replace it, not necessarily different standards, but be interested to hear if you have thoughts on how that would play out. We'd love to hear it. Bob, your hand is up again.
Sorry, I certainly don't want to dominate the conversation. I did just want to respond, since you sort of opened the door on that idea that I asked about. For now, I would just say I don't want to, shoot from the hip in terms of speaking for my organization or anybody else. But it just occurred to me that because, recognizing all of the kind of levels of cases like you were describing, and I think there are, from our perspective and experience, a lot of folks may have, a lot of claimants may have inadvertently contributed to an overpayment, but it certainly wasn't malicious. And I think that those are the cases where, depending on individual circumstances, the equity and good conscience standard gets a little bit murkier than situations where, if the department miscalculated something, obviously that's not on the claimant. They wouldn't have, they would have no way of contributing to that. Obviously, fraud is a whole separate, issue that is not part of this conversation. But those cases in the middle are more challenging, maybe. And I would not, especially to reinforce the comments that my colleagues were already making, because the process is a little bit opaque or confusing for claimants, being able to break out maybe just a couple levels of standards so that those are more understandable, that might help lead to a more equitable outcome, where you don't have certain types of claimants saying, well, I'm going to file for a waiver and see what happens, versus other claimants who are like, I don't know, I don't want to deal with this, and they sort of wash their hands of the process. That's not that's not an equitable system. That's just, having people roll the dice. And I don't think any of us want to see things end up in that kind of situation. With that, I'm going to be quiet. Thank you very much for the time.
Absolutely. And one thing I should, I could bring up too, so although we have the standard for the waiver, if someone doesn't meet the waiver criteria, we do have different offset. So if we offset future benefits, we do have different percentages, and we'll be looking at that also later on once our modernized system goes live. So that might be something we can fold into that conversation, Bob. Just a reminder, if you have a comment or a question, please either put it in the Q&A box and we'll be happy to answer that, or record it. And if you would like to speak, just raise your hand. Looks like the bulk of our participants have dropped off the call. So I'll go ahead and give a 5-minute warning that we're going to end early. But if you do have a comment or question, do feel free to raise your hand so that I can call on you, or go ahead and put it in the Q&A box. Alrighty, that brings us to the end of our time today. This listening session was recorded and it will be posted on our website at unemployment.oregon.gov. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and providing your feedback. We really appreciate it. Thanks again. Have a great day.